Welcome to episode 3, where we're going to talk about a very important topic in NestJs, which is providers. We're going to talk about this service right here, this injectable decorator, and then we're going to explain how we can inject that service in a controller or in another service to be used, and we're going to explain dependency injection and how it's handled by NestJs behind the scenes. So sit back and focus because this video is very important. Now, in the last episode, we explained controllers. We said that the controller is simply a class that has the controller decorator, and that the role of this class is to handle incoming HTTP requests using the handlers which we talked about. Today, we're going to look at this service layer right here. Okay, so if you take a look at the signs, first of all, we can see that the controller depends on the service, and then the service depends on the data access layer. Now, to better understand this, you should know that in backend applications, you obviously don't have all of your logic in one place. You don't have the controller handling the logic of your application and then the database queries or operations. So you would need to divide that to different layers, and every layer should have its own tasks. So the controller's role is to handle the HTTP requests, and then the service role is to handle the business logic. So the controller must depend on this service. Now, that's a best practice. Of course, you could just put all of your logic in the controller, but that's a very bad practice. So typically you would need to create a service to handle your business logic. And then on top of that, you would also have a repository where you would have your database schema and models. And this is the place where you access your database and where you have your operations. So if we take a look again, we can see that the controller would depend on the service and the service would depend on the data access layer. Now, there's a pattern here. As you can see, every class that is dependent on by another class or by another entity has this @injectable decorator here. So this injectable decorator, whenever it's used with a class, it marks them as a provider. Now, in this case, we can see that the service is a provider and the data access layer, which is the repository, is also a provider because they both have the injectable decorator. Now, what is the main role of a provider? Well, it's to be injected in different places in your application, so you can have them as dependencies. And let's take a look at the documentation as a reference. They say that many of the basic Nest classes may be treated as a provider, such as services, repositories, the two examples we gave, factories, helpers, and so on. And they also state that the main idea of a provider is that it can be injected as a dependency, just like we also said, meaning objects can create various relationships with each other, just like we've seen in the diagram. Now, let's just apply what we learned so far. But first, I'm going to delete the app controller and the app service and then create a different module because I like to keep app module at the root module and not have any controllers or services in there. So let's go ahead and remove app controller, app service, remove those. So now we have an empty module. And then let's just say nest g, meaning generate, and then let's say controller. Let's just call this one customer, for example. As you can see, we got a customer folder here with a customer class. And then, as you can see as well, we got the controller decorator generated for us. So marking this as a controller, and we also have a path prefix of customer. Now let's go ahead and create our customer service. So customer.service.ts. And let's export a new class and let's call it customer service. And then, just like we said previously, we're going to mark it as injectable, so the injectable decorator that we're going to import from NestJs common. Now that we marked this class as injectable, we know that this is a provider, and a provider can be injected as a dependency. So here we can do that. So let's create a constructor, and then inside of the constructor, let's say private customer service, and the type is the customer service that we just created. So of course, this can be named anything you want. This is the name of the variable. And here, this private keyword here is just a shorthand for declaring this new customer service data member of the customer controller and then setting it in the same line. Instead of that, you could have said, of course, private, for example, customer, and then you could have said here this dot customer equal customer service. But I like to use the private notation. It's a quicker way and it's a TypeScript feature. Now we can see that we have injected the customer service, which is this provider right here. It's a provider again because it's marked with @injectable. We have injected it inside of our controller. So now the controller class depends on the customer service, because anytime we create this controller, you know that in OOP, whenever you create an instance of a class, you're going to invoke the constructor right away. So here we can see that we have a dependency in our constructor, which is on the customer service. So we depend on that service inside of our controller. Now inside of the customer service, I added a new member called customers, which is an array of customers. And then I've created two different functions. The first one that returns the customers array, and then the second one which creates new customers, which will take a cross customer. Now, of course, it would be best to have DTOs to show the shape of the customer, but for now I'm focusing on the provider. And then here we're just pushing the new customer into that array. Now in our controller, we're going to add some handlers. As you can see, we've created two different handlers in our controller, one which is of type get and the second one post, to get our customers and then to create a new one. And then inside of get, we can say return this dot customer service, so we can make use of our service now, dot customers, which is going to return our customers. My bad, get all customers actually. And then here we need to create a new customer. We can say this dot customer service dot create customer, and then we need to pass in a customer. So that's why I used add body here. If you recall, in episode 2 we talked about this decorator. So I'm just going to pass the body. Now if you remember, last time in episode 2 I said that whenever we have controllers we need to register them in a module. For now I'm gonna register the customer controller inside of the app module, but it's not a best practice. A better practice would of course be to create a customer.module.ts file in which we're going to put the customer controller, and then we would register that customer module inside the app module here, and we would import it. But just to be quicker, I'm going to run the server and then try those APIs. So let's say npm run start dev, and now we're gonna see an error that might occur a lot of time with you, so I want you to be careful here. As you can see, Nest can't resolve dependencies of the customer controller. So this is the customer controller. It can't resolve its dependency, which is the customer service. Please make sure that the argument customer service at index 0 is available in the app module context. And they also give you potential solutions. So it asks you, is app module a valid NestJs module? If customer service is a provider, that's our case, it is a provider because it's noted with @injectable. Is it part of the current app module? If you take a look at app module, well, it's not a part of it. It's not in the providers array. It's not registered yet. And then they say if customer service is exported from a separate module, is that module imported within app module? We're going to see that in a bit maybe. But now this is the solution, the second one. The app module does not have the customer service provider registered. So we simply just copy that, and then in app module we just add this to our providers array, and then we of course need to provide it. Now if I press save to restart the server, as you can see, it started. Now in Postman, if I try to hit on localhost 3000/customers, as we can see we don't have any customer yet. Let's go to the post API. Let's send this with this body. Of course, it's better practice to have a DTO and validation. We're gonna see that in the future, don't worry, in future episodes. But now if I hit get, as you can see, we got a new customer. So this time, in this episode, instead of just returning everything from the controller, we have a service, which is a provider because of @injectable, and then we're using dependency injection inside of our controller, inside of our constructor specifically. So this is a constructor-based dependency injection. And this time the service is the one handling the business logic. Of course, we could also have customer.dataaccesslayer.ts, for example, and then we would have the queries there, and then we would, inside of our customer service, have a constructor and then inject the DAL service in here and then use it as well. But for now, we're just gonna be using controller and service. So the steps to create a provider is @injectable on top of a class. Then you can inject it using the private, for example, keyword inside of the constructor. And then you need to register it in the providers array inside of your module. Now what I've done is I created a customer.module.ts and then I just copied the app module and pasted it here. So now here we can remove the customer controller, remove the customer service, and instead, just like I told you before, just to keep it clean and have different modules separately, what we can do is, because right now the application does not know about this module if I save and run, because the root module doesn't know that the customer module with the controller and service exists. So now if I go ahead and hit on the routes, it's not gonna know about them. It's gonna give 404. So what we need to do is go to the app module.ts and then in the import say customer module. But of course we should not forget to change the module name here to customer module. And then we save it, and in app module we need to import the right path. And now if I save again and I go back to Postman, I create a new customer and then I hit on get. As you can see, it's working fine. But this time we have separated the application into real modules. So we have a customer module with its controller and service, and we have the root module here, which is app.module, which just imports the different modules in our application. Now it's important to note that since the customer service or this provider is inside of the customer module, it cannot be injected, okay? It cannot be injected in, for example, controllers from different modules unless you export. Let's see what I mean. Now I'm gonna teach you a new command, nest generate or nestg resource and cats, let's say. So as we've seen, we had nestg controller to create a controller. Now we can use resource to create a module. So we can choose something from here, REST API or GraphQL, microservice WebSockets. We need REST API. Would you like to create CRUD operations? No. So now as you can see, we got a new folder, cats. I'm gonna remove the testing files. So as you can see, cats module, we have a controllers array where we have a cats controller, okay, marked with controller, and then we can see that it has injected a dependency to cat service, which is a provider because it's marked with @injectable, and of course it has been added to the providers array here in this module so it can be used after being registered. Now let's say we wanted to use this service, this provider, customer service, inside of cat controller. What would happen? Would it work or not? Let's try this out. So let's say we had customer service here, and then let's create a handler. Of course we need to import that, and then let's create a handler. Let's say @get, and we need to do return this.customer or this.customer service, let's call it this.customer service dot get all customers, just like we did there. If I save this, all right, and we can see here that Nest can't resolve dependencies of the cats controller. Please make sure that blah, blah, blah. We've seen this error before. And to solve it before, we had to take a look at potential solution number 2, where we just needed to add this provider in its own module since we're using it in the same module. Now we're going to look at potential solution 3. If customer service is exported from a separate module, is that module imported within cats module? So there are 2 steps to do here. First of all, it should be exported from this module. So here, on top of imports, controller, and providers, we can add something other than those, which is exports. And then here we can add the customer service. So we can export that to the outside, to different modules outside of this current module. And the next thing we should do is that module imported within cats module. If we take a look at cats module, nope, we do not have this customer module imported. So we need to say imports, and then we need to pass in customer module. Okay, now if we restart, as you can see, it's working. And now if I hit on /cat or /cats, my bad, as you can see, we got the empty array because we don't have any customer. But if we add one now and hit on send, as you can see, we were able to use the customer service or this provider in a different module. But to do that, we had to do 2 steps. First of all, we had to export this provider from this module where it lives, and then we had to import the whole module inside of this. Be careful here, you should not do customer service as an import, okay? Instead, because now if we try to save this, as you can see we got an error, what we instead should be doing is import the whole customer module. Once we do that, what NestJs does is it goes to this import, it goes to this module, and then it takes a look at the exports array. Every provider that exists inside of this export array will be imported within this module, wherever we have the import customer module. Now, just like we had some metadata for the controller decorator, we have the same for the providers. So add injectable can take some options. If we take a look, we can see that it takes durable and scope. I want to talk about scope. If you take a look at scope, it takes an enum of scope, so we can say scope. So if we take a look at scope, we can see that it has different values. Default, for example, the provider can be shared across multiple classes. The provider lifetime is strictly tied to the application lifecycle. Once the application has bootstrapped, all providers have been instantiated. So basically, default is treated as a singleton, and that's the default behavior. You don't have to set it manually if you want to use the provider as a singleton. You have requests as well, for example. A new instance is instantiated for each request processing pipeline. You're creating new instances for every request. But most use cases, we're going to be using the default one, so we don't even need to set the scope, which is just a singleton. So in our case, when we're using or when we're injecting this provider in the controller here, we're creating a new instance if it does not exist. Nest is creating a new instance, just like we've seen. So whenever we also inject it in a different place, just like here, for example, we're just injecting it again, Nest is going to take a look at the scope of that provider being injected, okay? It's going to see that it's the default one, meaning a singleton. So it's going to look at the cache. It's going to look, does it already have an instance of this provider existing? Does it have customer service already? If so, then it would give that same instance, since it's a singleton, to this CAS controller to be used as well. If not, it's going to create a new instance that can also be used and be shared across different modules, since we said by default it's a singleton. And we can see what I just said in the documentation. Here it says Nest will resolve the CAT service by creating and returning an instance of CAT service. This is explaining that whenever we have CAT service in the constructor of CAT's controller, that Nest is going to resolve it. And in the normal case of a singleton, which is the default scope for providers, it's going to be returning the existing instance if it has already been requested elsewhere. If not, it's of course going to create it. So we can see that Nest is managing the dependency injection for us. We can see some more details about dependency injection here. It's an inversion of control, IOC technique, where we delegate the instantiation of dependencies to the IOC container. Well, in our case, it's the NestJs runtime system. So basically, we leave the instantiation of our dependencies to NestJs. That will be happening behind the scenes. Once we run our application, it's going to take a look at our root module, it's going to take a look at our providers, our imports, it's going to go to our modules, take a look at the providers to see if we have dependencies, then it's of course going to check the controllers to see if it depends on anything else, and then based on those relationships, it's going to see what it should create before what. It's also worth mentioning that in the registration step of the provider, just like we said, whenever we add it to the providers array in a module, that's when we are registering it. What happens behind the scene is that we are registering the provider with the Nest IOC container. So it's going to be handled by the NestJs runtime system. And here we can see some more details if you're interested. It says that whenever the Nest IOC container instantiates a CAT controller, just like I said previously, it's going to look for any dependencies. It finds the CAT service dependency inside of the constructor, so it's going to perform a lookup on the CAT service, and then it will look based on the scope. Let's assume it's a singleton, just like I said previously. It's going to create an instance of CAT service if it does not exist, and then cache it and return it. But if one is already cached and the type and the scope is singleton, it's going to return the existing instance and use it. So far, we've been registering our providers in this way. Inside of our modules, we would add the class name in the providers array so that we register that provider, and after that, we are going to be able to inject it into our constructors so that we can use it as a dependency. Now, the documentation tells us that this syntax is a shorthand for the more complex syntax, which is this here. So instead of actually passing the class name inside of the providers array, we're actually passing an object now with two different properties, provide and use class. For both, we used the cat service name as a value. So here they are explaining how the registration process works. They tell us that we are assigning the token cat service, which is here, so provide takes a token, with the class cat service. So here we're saying use class, and then we're providing our class cat service. And this is why we can use the shorthand notation, since both of those use the same name. So here the token is used to request, so the token cat service is used to request an instance of a class, which is this cat service as well, that goes by the same name. This is why this shorthand term exists. And this covers most of our use cases when using providers. However, in Nest, you can create your own custom providers. What if you don't want to use the same token as the class? Well, let's take a look here. Here we are providing the cat service name as a token, and then we are, instead of doing use class and giving it cat service, we're doing use value and giving it a mock cat service. If you take a look at mock cat service, it's an object. So now this token, whenever we inject it, the cat service inside of a constructor, it's not going to resolve into the cat service class anymore. Instead, it's going to resolve into this object, mock cat service. Of course, this way, whenever we have a token that is different than the provider that it should resolve into, we can no longer use the quick way, since it's not the same name anymore. So we can no longer use this way that we've been using before. And we can read the documentation. The cat service token, this, is going to resolve into the mock cat service mock object. Use value requires a value, which is an object that has the same interface as our cat service, which is this object here. So whenever we inject it in a constructor, it's going to resolve into this mock cat service instead of the actual cat service. And here they say that this works because of TypeScript structure typing. So you can use any object that has a compatible interface, including a literal object, like we've seen here, or a class instance instantiated with new. Now in both scenarios, this one here where we use the mock cat service as a value, and then here where we use the cat service as a use class, we used a class name, cat service and cat service, as a token name. However, in NestJs, you can also use a string. Now you should be careful. Whenever we set the token as a string like that here, we can no longer inject it this way. So before we used to say constructor private cat service, and then since we have already registered this cat service inside of the module, Nest would take a look. If it's this way, then it knows that the token is cat service and the provider is also cat service. It resolves into the same class. Or it would take a look and then it would see that, okay, cat service is going to be resolved into this object, and then it is going to inject that object in that constructor. However, now in our case, we have something that doesn't exist. Like whenever we give it this string, this is not an existing class. Well, thankfully, we can use this way. We can say add inject in our constructor, and then we provide the token name. So Nest is going to look at the token name, and then it's going to look at our providers array, and it will see, okay, token connection should use value connection. Connection here comes from a different file, it's an object. So whenever we see add inject connection, this token is going to be resolved to this object here, so it will be injected and can be used in this class. Let's see one more important use case for custom providers. So for example here, we have, okay, we are passing the config service class name as a token, because provide takes a token, and then use class. Here, as you can see, we have a condition. We are checking if our application is running in development environment or not. If it is, then this token should be resolved into development config service class. If not, it should resolve into production config service. So we can see that use class is dynamic. Also here note that we created or we used the properties provide and use class inside of a new variable that we created instead of just writing them down right here right away, but it's the same. We could have just taken provide and use class and put them here in an object without using this extra variable. This is just to organize your code. Here they explain what I just said, that they have used the config service class name as a token. We've seen that multiple times now so far, and that for any class that depends on config service in a constructor, if we have config service as a dependency, Nest is going to inject an instance of the provided class, either development config service or production config service, depending on this condition right here. You can also check factory providers and alias providers. I'm not going to cover them in this video. You can check them out in the documentation of NestJs in Fundamentals, Custom Providers. We already covered 90% of the use cases for providers, and you're good to go. But if you want to check more information, I invite you to the documentation. To summarize it quickly, in this video we've seen that whenever we have a service or maybe a data access layer or helpers or whatever, if you want to inject them as a dependency somewhere else in our application, we would need to use the @injectable decorator, which takes some options in which we can specify the scopes. By default, it's the singleton scope, meaning it's gonna be one single instance created by the IOC container by NestJs and used across the application, so it's going to be shared. And a provider is just something that can be injected as a dependency. Just like we've seen, for example, the service can be injected as a dependency in the controller, for example. And then we should not forget the third step, which is to go to our module and then to add that provider in the providers array. We've also seen that if you want to use that provider in a different module in our application, we would need to add it to the exports array of our module. And then in the second module, where we want to make use of that service, we would need to import the whole module. So here cats controller depends on the customer service. We have injected the customer service in cats controller. To be able to use it, we would need to first of all export it from the customer module, and then inside of cats module we would need to import the whole customer module. Be careful again, not customer service but the whole customer module. We also covered custom providers and how we can use different tokens in different ways, and then we can use a class or a value to be injected. I hope this video was clear. If you're still watching, you obviously liked the video, so please leave a like, subscribe, leave a comment, and I'll see you in episode 4.